This is a slide that I'm particularly fond of. It's a slide prepared by Rivers Agency, and it's just very striking, I think, in that it shows the extent of lakes, rivers and their tributaries in Northern Ireland. It's just a very, very striking visual image. Today we're going to focus on the Lower Bann. As Garth said, the longest river in Northern Ireland, 32 miles in length. In an Irish context, I suppose, a very large river. And Lough, we'll touch on Lough as well, the largest freshwater lake in the United Kingdom. So the Bann Valley, I suppose, has been the focus of settlement right back from the earliest history of habitation on this island. The earliest known habitation site in Ireland is, of course, in Mount Sandal near Coleraine. Hunter-gatherers fished in the River Bann, hunted in the forests adjoining the river from as far back as 7000 BC. So it's the earliest known habitation site in Ireland. Okay, so a terribly important site. Important not only for its age, for its antiquity, but also for the fact that it challenged our stereotypes about hunter-gatherers and their way of life. Because excavations, led by Professor Peter Woodman and his team here in Mount Sandal, demonstrated that this hunter-gatherer site was not occupied just for a part of the year, for a period of the year, but was occupied on an all-year-round basis. So the hunter-gatherers fished for salmon in spring and summer, they collected hazelnuts in the autumn time, fished for eel, and hunted wild pig in the winter time. So they were able to draw on the natural resources of the area, which were there in abundance, and live there year-round. Okay, so very significant site, obviously. And since then, both for the very fact that the River Bann is an important means of communication, and also for the natural resources that it affords, the Bann Valley, the Lower Bann Valley, proved to be a magnet for habitation from that time onwards. But there was sort of a double-edged sword with that, I suppose, in that the Lower Bann has always been beset by seasonal flooding, okay, which is a terrible problem, especially in the lowlands between Toome and Kilrea. So from as early as 1738, there's been reports, studies, investigations into how to deal best with this problem, this ongoing problem of seasonal flooding on the Lower Bann. And I'm just going to provide an overview of that today. I've provided a handout which gives some of the main archival sources in PRONI that I'll be drawing on, and this is very much an introduction to the sources that are there and an overview of this problem and how it was tackled over the years. So here's just a nice image, it's on your handout as well, showing the catchment of the Bann, and also showing flooding in the Bann as well, the extent of lands affected by flooding. And it was estimated that before the major arterial drainage operations of the mid-19th century, that some 30,000 acres of land were beset by seasonal flooding, year on year. So a huge amount of land beset by seasonal flooding. And the history of flooding on the Bann and on people's efforts to address this challenge, and also on a secondary level to improve navigation on the river, because problems which resulted in flooding, mainly natural obstructions in the river, also hindered navigation on the river. So from 1738 onwards, you see various reports, studies into how do we address these two problems. I've just outlined some of the main archival sources in PRONI that answer those questions or demonstrate how people tackle this problem. So most of the records here and on your handouts are from former Ministry of Finance files. Okay, and Fin 9, Fin for Finance, Fin 9 specifically deals with the Bann and Lough. Okay, so if you're searching our e-catalogue either at home or trying to order material in the search room later on or at another stage, it's this area, Fin 9, that you'll be looking for in the catalogue. So Fin 9 bar 1 includes minutes and reports. It includes minute books of the trustees of the Lower Bann Navigation and also the Lough Drainage District. It also contains various 19th and 20th century reports. On your handout there, I've mentioned one report that I'll be talking about in detail, the Mcmullen Report of 1845, which we don't hold an original copy of, but I've given you the reference number there. It was reproduced in a later report of 1884, so you can order it out that way, and it's well worth reading. Bar 9, Bar 2, maps and plans, a wealth of material, beautiful visual material there, mainly dating, I'm afraid, from 19th and 20th century, very little earlier than that, but very lovely to look at. Correspondence, and a huge amount of correspondence from landowners complaining about flooding of their lands. Okay. Financial records, and again, financial records both in relating to navigation and to drainage. So from the navigation point of view, records relating, say, for example, to tolls and wharfage on the river. From a navigation point of view, records in relation to the rates people were charged. Because people whose land benefited from measures to mitigate against the flooding were charged a rate. So they're detailed in that section of the archive. Legal records includes numerous legal cases, claims against both the navigation trustees and the drainage trustees. And the final section, the works section, is very interesting. It mainly relates to the later periods of works on the river from the 1930s to the early 1940s. But it's good in that it actually includes detailed specifications for works. Okay, so it's very interesting to read through as well. So plenty to get one's teeth into there. So just moving on then maybe to the statutory background, to the legislative background to what we're going to talk about today. So the Board of Works was established by Act of Parliament in 1831. It was responsible for the disposal of public funds, and it also acted as a lending agency. From its early years, it had responsibility for drainage, but progress was slow. Even after the passage of this Act, the Drainage Ireland Act 1842. Under the terms of this 1842 Act, a landowner could make an application to have drainage works undertaken on his lands under the supervision of members of the Board of Works, provided that they could get the approval of up to 2/3 of the people whose lands were affected, and also most of the money had to come from private sources. Okay. Now the money could then, it was envisaged, be recouped through rates, but money had to be provided up front. Okay, so there was a limited enough uptake on applications under this Act. But things changed dramatically then from 1845 onwards. So can anyone suggest what happened at that period that would have changed things? The famine, exactly. So in 1845, from autumn 1845 onwards, famine years happened. There was all of a sudden a huge need to create public works to provide employment to the destitute, because of the moral thinking of the time that rather than to provide charity for those that were literally starving, better to provide them with work through which they could be paid for this. So drainage works were seen as one way by which large-scale public works could be initiated. There was then a huge demand. There was a huge demand for drainage works, which led to a subsequent act, the Drainage Act of 1846. Under this act, you only had to get agreement from half of those landowners whose land would be affected by the proposed works. Okay, so from 2/3 down to a half. And while there was still a need for private funds, there was no need to provide money up front. And the government would have a contributory part to pay in terms of finance. Okay, so major changes there. As I said, drainage streams were considered to be an obvious labour-intensive means of providing employment for the destitute. And from the mid-19th century onwards, drainage works were undertaken in 113 drainage districts throughout Ireland. Now, the scale of the works undertaken were utterly unprecedented, not just in an Irish scale or a British scale, but in a European-wide scale. They were huge. Okay, absolutely huge, unprecedented. Between 1845 and 1852, I've made a note here, land belonging to over 3,000 landowners was improved. Okay, land belonging to over 3,000 landowners at a cost of almost, a staggering cost for the time, a cost of almost £2 million to the Treasury. Okay, so you can appreciate the scale of what we're talking about there. So to enable such huge undertakings, the Drainage Act of 1846 was passed. In 1844, the Drainage Commissioners received an application from landowners in the vicinity of Lough and the Lower Bann for a survey and a report to inform drainage works on the Lower Bann. The Board of Works directed Mr. John Mcmullen, a leading engineer of the time, to prepare a report, and his report appeared in December 1845. The Mcmullen Report, and I've given you the reference number as I said there on the handout, I can't recommend it highly enough. It's a lovely report. It's useful not just as a study of industrial archaeology on the river at the time in terms of the bridges, the fish weirs, etc., but also the local history of the Lower Bann Valley, and of course a study of the river itself and its hydrology. Okay. It's also, although it doesn't sound like it, it's a really, really readable report. Mcmullen has a lovely writing style. It's a lovely report to read. As he states himself at the beginning of the report, I aim at effecting by a recital of facts easy of verification, rather than by the publication of a series of voluminous and obtruse calculations, only comprehensible to men of science, practice in the examination of hydrodynamic questions. So he's wanting to cut through all of that and just get to the heart of the matter, which he does. So when Mcmullen was preparing his report, he looked at the ban and set out the particular and very great challenges that it posed to those that were seeking to improve the drainage of the river. He points first of all to the vast expanse of water covered by Lough itself, okay, the largest freshwater lake in the British Isles. He points to the numerous rivers and tributaries feeding into the lake, and the fact that there's only one outlet to the lake at Toom. Okay, all these rivers discharging and tributaries discharging into this huge body of water, only one outlet to it. So concerns straight away in terms of drainage. As he says himself in his lovely language, only one outlet from the lough, the Lower Bann, which is what we're focusing on, allotted by nature to convey the entire of these accumulated waters to the sea. Then Mcmullen goes on to outline some of the specific problems within the Lower Bann itself. So one of the worst areas in terms of flooding was around the Cuts, an area known as the Cuts, just south of Coleraine, and here, slide. Here a large basalt ridge goes right across the river and caused a major obstruction, which in times of heavy rainfall always led to flooding. Also a number of man-made obstructions such as the eel weirs there, which also compounded the problem. He also pointed to another area where flooding was inevitable year on year, and that was at Port Neagh. Again, steep ridge going across the river here with various steps within it. The river had a very rapid flow at this point as well, so it was another problem point. Then looking at Toom itself, remember the only outlet to the whole of Lough at Toom, and what happens there? We have a sandbar going across the river. So a huge obstruction in the river, and again, leading and compounding to the problems of flooding year on year. So Mcmullen, in his report, he talks about the obvious benefits to landowners in terms of improving drainage in the river and tackling flooding. So there'd be an obvious benefit for landowners. He talks about the benefit for navigation, because up until now, navigation only extended as far as Port Neagh. Beyond that, it wasn't possible, and Port Neagh itself was too treacherous to go any further than. So he talks about the advantages of making the river more navigable. Up to now, it was only navigable in short localized stretches. And then he also points to something that we mightn't necessarily think of, an improvement to the health of the people. He points to evidence produced by the Poor Law Commissioners, who gathered evidence from various medical practitioners, and time again, something that comes out when you look at that evidence that provided by the doctors is that ill health was more prevalent among those living in lands susceptible to flooding than elsewhere. And this is nicely summarised in a quote by Dr. Arda here when he talks about his district, part of which runs along the Black River for about 4 miles, which overflows to a considerable extent every year. I have observed that families residing here near those lowlands which are subject to flooding are every year attacked by 3 different diseases: fever, rheumatism and inflammation of the lungs. I can safely say that the former of these diseases commences every year in the locality above alluded to, and of course spreads into the neighbouring townlands. So by grappling with the problem of improving the drainage of the Bann, the lower Bann, Mcmullen is saying you'll also improve the health of the people. So 3 main reasons for tackling this great problem. While there may have been very valid reasons for improving drainage on the River Bann, not everyone was in favour of it. Okay, there was those that were very strongly opposed to it for varying reasons. And I've mentioned on your handout, it's a small collection of legal papers, but very interesting to go through. It's reference D460 on your handout. Small collection of legal papers which more or less sets the scene, sets the case for and against drainage on the River Bann, on the lower Bann. Part of the papers, this section, bar 2, is a brief prepared by Lord Lurgan and others who in 1844 were the very ones who applied to the Board of Works for that report, the Mcmullen Report, to be commissioned. Come 1846, as works seem imminent, there's various local meetings and people are given a chance to, to set the case for arguing against those works. So this summarises the efforts by Lord Lurgan and others from 1842 onwards, from that 1842 Act onwards, to try and get improved drainage on the lower Bann. Very, very interesting to read through. Lord Lurgan himself makes the point that Mcmullen did as well. He talks in terms of improving the health of the people. And interestingly, he died of cholera in 1846, just as an aside. So in 1846, Lord Lurgan applied for the government for a grant of public money for the works, to carry out the works under the Mcmullen Report. The application was approved. The application, just as a matter of interest, was approved by none other than Charles Trevelyan, the civil servant who I suppose was responsible for administrating relief, for better or worse, in Ireland during the famine period, but that's just an aside. In May 1846, the Drainage Commissioners, as I said, published a notice stating that works were to be carried out, and a series of local meetings took place. And a huge range of people opposed the measures to drain the Bann. As this individual here, Henry Richardson from McCauskin, who stated that his land would not be benefited in any material manner at all. So some people felt that it would be no benefit to their lands to be drained, and obviously they would be charged rates on their lands if they were improved, so they just didn't want the works at all. Other people said that the valuation of their land was too high, and again that had a bearing on the rates that they were charged. Some said, we don't actually have any land that will be affected, improved by these drainage operations, but we're going to be charged rates. So obviously they objected. Others argued that Lord Lurgan had provided an inaccurate estimate of the loss of crops, so they felt that the damage wasn't as bad as people were making out. And then of course there was the navigation interests, who wanted the river levels obviously to be kept as high as possible. And they put in a claim for £60,000 in compensation. They noted that the proposal to keep the waters of Lough Neagh permanently at summer level would be what they termed a fatal obstacle for the future improvement of the river for navigable purposes. Okay, so very, very strong voices opposing the proposed works. But objections aside, works on the Mcmullen scheme commenced in 1847. Now, John Mcmullen had estimated that the works would take 3 years. They took 12 years and longer. Most of the works were finished in 1859, some continued into the early 60s, some continued as far as 1861. So a huge investment in terms of time and resources. I think it was estimated that £250,000 was spent on the works. Okay, so huge, huge, huge undertaking. The government contributed £100,000 and the remainder then was charged to those lands who allegedly, and did indeed, receive relief from flooding, and also those from whom got benefited from new navigation works. Okay. So, just taking a step back for a moment. I should have said, sorry, navigation works included canals and locks put in place at various points on the lower Bann, such as Toome, Port Neagh, Mcmullen, and at the Cuts. Okay, so important navigation works were undertaken at the same time as the drainage works. Just going back a wee bit in time, under the 1842 Drainage Act that I spoke about earlier on, trustees were appointed for each drainage district, including the Lough Neagh Drainage District, to make sure that the necessary maintenance works were undertaken on the river. This is just a slide again taken from some of those ministry finance files. There's some lovely material in there. This is just 1868 call for trustees for the Lough Neagh district. The minute books within this collection again are very, very good. Great that year on year they record month by month rainfall. They record maximum and minimum depths on the river and on Lough Neagh. They detail works undertaken, money spent, names of contractors even undertaking the work. So very, very, very interesting from a local history point of view as well as a study of the river. Now, in the minute books, in the early years after the works of the Mcmullen scheme concluded, the district engineer is full of praise for the works. No flooding occurs, no flooding of any note occurs for several years. The district engineer at the time, a man called William J. O'Neill, is extremely proud of the works and talking about how much of a difference they've made to landowners in the area. But by 1869, his reports start to become a bit negative. He notes incidences of flooding occurring in heavy rainfall, so flooding is starting again. Okay, the measures that had alleviated flooding, they're just not working anymore. The language in the minute books at this time, it includes letters, deputations from landowners. The language is very, very strong. Landowners are talking about the works as useless, the lower Bann navigation as a failure, and demanding action to protect their lands. For example, at one meeting in Toome in 1877, they called for the removal of the weirs in the lower Bann below Lough Beg. And in the minute books, you see the trustees grappling with the difficulty of trying to balance the different needs of different interest groups. Balancing the needs of navigation on the one hand, the landowners on the other hand, and those who operated eel and salmon fisheries. And it's just all extremely difficult because they have conflicting needs, and those needs can be addressed in different ways. Things came to a head though in 1877 when severe flooding occurred. Severe flooding occurred in 1877, the worst flooding since the completion of the works under the Mcmullen scheme. Okay, so things came to a head. The district engineer, William O'Neill, that I mentioned earlier on, you can tell he's torn. He's a huge admirer of Mcmullen, a huge admirer of his work. He says that no doubt to the skill and accuracy with which the late Mcmullen's observations were made, corroborated by others, his hydrologic facts speak for themselves. But he talks about the fact that the river is now having to deal with a greater flow of water. He says the lower Bann is now discharging double the quantity per minute to that which the works were designed for. So he's saying the works just aren't fit for purpose anymore. A report into the condition of the river was commissioned and produced, but no further works were undertaken at that time. So the next major report that has a bearing on the lower Bann was the Manning Report of 1884. Manning Report of 1884. Robert Manning, the Board of Works, was commissioned to prepare the report. He took a different standpoint from William O'Neill. He felt Mcmullen's data itself was faulty. He also made the point that a large quantity of sand and silt had accumulated in the river since the works had been completed, and obviously this was having an effect and leading to flooding. He made the very point that a very valid point that after 1859 there were the two bodies tasked with looking after the lower Bann. The Lower Bann Navigation Trustees and the Lower Bann Drainage Trustees each argued that the other was responsible for excavating the majority of the river channel. Neither were doing it, so the work wasn't happening. And because the river wasn't being maintained and excavated, flooding obviously kept on happening. So after Mcmullen's report, there was various works and various investigations taking place. Longitudinal study of the river here, dating to 1888. Proposals for excavations such as at Mavaneker, which didn't take place. Plans for new sluices at Toome. In 1888 and 1889, drainage bills were put through government, but they weren't enacted. So things were at a standstill again, and the matter was getting worse. Flooding was getting worse. People were getting more and more frustrated. But in terms of anything significant happening, we have to jump forward to 1926 and another report. Okay, I'm bombarding you with reports now. I'm sorry about that. But a later report, the Shepherd report, Percy Shepherd's report in 1926, found that the Mcmullen scheme had failed because many of its recommendations had only been partly carried out. And he made the point that in many stretches of the river, no dredging had taken place. Okay, so on the basis of the Shepherd report, something very, very positive, I suppose, was proposed. So the entire river channel was to be dredged. Over 5 million cubic feet of soft material was removed from the river. Okay, the works took place between 1930 to 1942. Okay, huge amount of work there. The scheme also saw various measures taking place, such as the fixed weirs at Toome, Portland, and the cuts were replaced with sluice gates, which could be opened and closed and controlled in times of flooding. Okay, so new measures taken place. I'm afraid, and I don't have time to go into it in any major detail, but just a point to note when we're talking about the drainage works, a sort of unexpected fringe benefit of the drainage work was the recovery of a significant amount of prehistoric metalwork and Stone Age material from the rivers, not just from the River Bann, but from the other rivers that were being dredged in the 19th and 20th centuries, the Erne, the Shannon, the Barrow. Okay, but going back to the 19th century work, we have the endeavours of this man, this engineer, W.T. Mulvaney, to thank for the recovery of artefacts from the Bann and other rivers. Mulvaney, a fascinating character, an engineer who was tasked with he was drainage officer, I suppose I should say, with the Board of Works from 1842 until 1843. He was tasked with the responsibility of overseeing all the arterial drainage works that were being undertaken at that time. Remember, that's spread across 113 drainage districts, affecting lands belonging to 3,000 people. So a huge role, a huge role that he was responsible for. It was also Mulvaney that pushed and argued for the inclusion of drainage works when people were trying to think of public works that could be brought into place to give employment to the destitute during the famine years. Mulvaney was the one that pressed for drainage works to be included, and he was successful in that. So dealing with a huge amount of works, dealing with a starving workforce as well. So Mulvaney, all this going on in his head, he also is thinking about archaeology, which, you think the man has a lot to think about, but he's thinking about archaeology. And in an article, in a report rather, for the proceedings for the Royal Irish Academy in 1852, Mulvaney notes that the drainage operations provided, as he said, an opportunity rarely possessed for the recovery of archaeological material. And on his instructions, he asked that the district engineers responsible for each of the dredging operations should provide exact details for each artefact's find location. They were also instructed on how to recognise crannogs, how to recognise artificial lake habitations, and they were also requested to provide drawings and plans of any crannogs uncovered during their works. But I think it's really interesting looking at the instructions that Mulvaney gave to the engineers at the time. And as he says here, an object of great importance is to have the antiquities identified and the locality where they were found, and we therefore wish to have attached to each thing, each object recovered, a card with a description, and he was very specific, with a description on one side of the place where found, name of townland, parish, barony and county, and the name of the engineer by whose care and attention the object was recovered. On the other side of the card, a description of the precise locality, the material in which it is embedded, its depth, allusion to other antiquities found with it. So Mulvaney was a man ahead of his time. It's really textbook recommendations that archaeologists would be abiding by today. Mulvaney is saying it's not only important to look at the provenance of material, but also the context in which it was found. Okay, so very far-sighted man. Fascinating character whose career in Ireland, I'm afraid, ended under a cloud of ignominy, but that's a story for another day, maybe. But so Mulvaney was responsible for a huge amount of the material being recovered during the 19th century drainage operations. But as he said, for as many objects that were recovered and which found their way into, at the time, Dublin, into the National Museum in Dublin, where they were recorded by William Wilde in his catalogue, as many as were recovered, Mulvaney was under no illusions that an equal amount had been lost. Sold by workmen to traders, many of the objects ending up outside of Ireland. Okay, so for as many that were recovered, as many ended up outside the country. And there were also those workmen who decided maybe to took archaeological matters into their own hands. This is a lovely little anecdote. Each workman received a wee fee, a gratuity for any archaeological object they recovered. Now at this time, as well as the beautiful Bronze Age and Iron Age metalworks, literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of stone axe heads were recovered from the rivers. Hundreds of them. Quite crude. So some workmen, as in this example, decided, hell, do you know what, we'll make a few axe heads ourselves. So these two lads, after hours, got access to the grindstone used by the carpenters. They had a real axe head in front of them, and they just molded a stone to shape, then made it, I love it, after rubbing it with an oil dipped in mud or clay to give it an ancient appearance, they delivered it up and claimed the usual gratuity. So there is a bit of that going on as well, which confuses matter, but a huge amount of material recovered. As I say, I'm afraid I don't have time to go into it in much detail, but it wouldn't be right not to mention the most well-known artefact recovered from dredging operations, the Bann disc. Oops, sorry. So the Bann disc, tiny, you know, only 10.5 centimeters in diameter, three perforations, one with a ring, and they're there. You can't see it so well on the image there, but you can hear beautifully decorated for something so small, beautifully decorated with latten, with Iron Age decoration. The decoration in the form of a triskelay. The triskelay itself composed of swirling trumpet curves, each of which terminate in a bird's head. Beautiful, beautiful piece. Okay. Not sure if well, there's debate over whether the Bann disc was cast or whether the decoration was painstakingly tooled back, you know, and then it stood up in relief, or whether it was cast and the finer work done later on. But this was one of the objects recovered during dredging operations. Recovered from Camas Ford near Lough Island. Recovered in March 1939, the description goes, while dredging on the River Bann was being carried out at Camas Ford near Lough Island, and the description is quite good, just above Lough Graveyard in the sand and gravel near the east bank of the river. So just about there. So as I say, an interesting and for many people I suppose unexpected fringe benefit of the drainage works. But just to finish up, you have your hand out there with the reference number, and if you're interested in the Bann or if you're interested in anything else, remember you can always do a certain amount of research at home by searching our e-catalogue, so you can either search or browse the catalogue. I find it easier myself to browse. I find that an easier one to do. It just seems to work better. And just when you are browsing, just remember to keep always drilling down to the left. So that will break down into a number of subsections. Keep drilling down, and then when you finally get an item you want to look at, hit view at that stage. If you go to the right too soon, it just doesn't work so well. So always stick to the left is the key, and then drill down to the right. So thank you very much for listening to the talk.